Hi, everyone, and welcome to @Katie Couric. My guest today is as diverse and multifaceted as the people he writes about. Mitch Albom's book, Tuesdays with Morrie, was on the bestseller list for 4 years and has sold 14 million copies and counting. Well, now Mitch has got a brand new book out called Have a Little Faith. Mitch Albom, thanks for being here. And before we get to our conversation, may I just take a moment to thank our sponsors? Dove.
Oh.
If it weren't for Dove, we wouldn't be sitting here.
Yes. Okay.
So I think you should thank Dove as well.
I thank Dove. I thank Dove and Doves and all. Yes.
All right. So it's good to see you. And one thing that struck me, Mitch, as I was reading about your latest book is just how phenomenally well all your books have done. And so I guess congratulations are in order for that because, must be nice. But why do you think they have been so successful, and not only in this country, but in places like Ireland?
Yeah.
You should say, Katie, because they're really, really good.
Katie, because no, I wouldn't say that because, I've tried to think about that because, to be honest, as you know, I think you were one of the first people I talked to about Tuesdays with Morrie early on. That was an accident. That was a book written to pay Morrie's medical expenses.
Right.
It wasn't like I was sitting around going, oh, how do you write a book that millions of people are going to read? In fact, they printed 20,000 copies of it and thought that would be it. I thought I'd be selling them out of the trunk of my car for the rest of my life. So when that became popular, it really sort of stunned me. And I asked myself the same question, too. Well, what's the big deal? This is just me and Morrie. As time has passed, and it's been a long time now, I think if I had to break it down, it's that people can slide themselves into my books. Either they're me asking the questions of an old man who's dying, or they're Eddie and the 5 people you meet in heaven wondering if they mattered on earth and asking the questions that he did. There's always a character in my books that asks questions, usually about, kind of bigger things about what's life about or whatever. Mm-hmm. And maybe, if I had to guess, that would be it, that rather than just being a plot, a story about a particular character might be fascinating, interesting, but you're done with it, you put it down. People embrace these books, give them as gifts, and say, I'm in there. I see myself in there. And it's not like I'm aiming at them that way, but that seems to be the way they respond.
And they really deal with universal themes, and as you said, sort of questions, and I think relationships at their purest in a way, and I think people appreciate that, and that's probably why they gravitate to them as well.
I also don't rush to write them, and that may help. I don't have a schedule, and which is very rare in the publishing world. Generally, if you're at all successful in publishing, they want you every year at the same time. They want to carve out a little weekend every year that's when you come out. And I've always said I can't write like that. And it was 6 years between Tuesdays with Morrie and the 5 people you meet in heaven, which was an eternity in the publishing world. And they said, what are you doing? You're crazy. It was 3 years between that and the next one. It was 3 years for this one. I've gone from nonfiction to fiction and then back to nonfiction. Only because I only write something if I feel that it moved me in some way, so much so that I thought, A, I need to write this to get it out of me, and B, there's something here that people might be able to relate to. And so maybe that's why they work. That's the best guess I have, anyhow.
And you told me, I think I'm the 19th person you've been interviewed by your book tour.
Well, only because we're a little late in the process. You would have been first, but
sure. But you're heading to Ireland after this, so your books are very popular internationally, or at least in Ireland.
Yes, no, a lot of countries. They're published in about 40, 50 countries, and I've been to a number of them. I find that a great. Some authors don't want to go. Oh, I don't want to travel. I say, it's crazy. Someone in another language interviewing you, and you sit there and they go, Mr. Albom, when you write your books, I love it. It's wow, somebody's reading it. I can't even understand. I don't know which word is my name on the cover. I've seen some like in Russian. So which is my name and which is the title? And yet the people are reading them. It's as much as an author could ever ask for, and I'm overwhelmed by it.
Well, let me ask you about your newest book, which is called Have a Little Faith, and why did you decide to tackle faith as a topic this go-round?
Well, like Tuesdays with Morrie, it came to me. It wasn't something I ever thought about doing. And 9 years ago, I went back to the little town where I grew up in New Jersey. I gave a little talk there, and the rabbi from my childhood synagogue, who had been the only clergyman I'd ever had my whole life, pulled me aside, and he was 82 years old, and he said, I want to ask you a favor. He never asked me a favor before in my life. Okay, what? I'd like you to do the eulogy at my funeral. Well, that totally threw me because, number one, I wasn't very religious anymore, and number two, who was I to do a eulogy for the guy who does eulogies? You know?
Right.
I personally thought these people had it all worked out with themselves. You know, priests, pastors, you go first, I'll do you. I go first, you do me. So all I could think of was to say, well, I mean, if you really want me to do this, I need to get to know you as a human being. I've only known you from the seats. And he said, I accept. And that began what I thought would be a couple of months. But he lived 8 more years through strokes and a cancer scare and all kinds of things. And I got sort of a second education in faith at a different level, not in the services or in the sanctuary, but behind the scenes with what turned out to be 2 men of God away from the pulpit, and saw faith in a whole new light. And that's why I thought it would be an interesting topic.
Now, you say 2 men of God because you brought another individual into the process. Tell us about him.
Or he brought me.
Okay, and why that happened.
Yeah, well, I had gotten involved with the homeless, working with the homeless in Detroit, because it's a terrible problem in my city, as you know. And I had heard about this church that ran a homeless shelter out of the church itself, and people slept on the church floor, but it had this huge hole in its roof where rain and snow literally came in. And so I went to go see the pastor of this church, and he turned out to be a man who, when he was younger, was a thief, a drug dealer, an addict. He was incarcerated, the whole 9 yards, and turned his life around one night when he thought he was going to be murdered by his drug dealers. He was literally on the ground holding a shotgun behind a row of trash cans, and he looked up and he said, Jesus, if you get me through tonight, you can have me in the morning. Probably not expecting to get through the night. Well, he got through the night, and he actually kept his promise. And 20 years later, here he was at this broken-down church in Detroit, a guy who had once earned $500,000 a year selling drugs, now ministering to the poor and the homeless for nothing. I mean, he really didn't take a salary. And I got to know him, and as I got to know him, and I would spend, Sundays or Mondays or Tuesdays there, and then I'd go back to New Jersey and be in the suburbs with this venerable older man, and then back again in Detroit. And I thought, wow, you can't have 2 people who are more different, and yet they're united by this one very powerful thing, faith, that they are relying on to get them through their individual challenges, the rabbi who was about to die and the pastor who was in danger of losing his church. And I said, if you can connect these 2 dots, then faith really must be something that weaves its way through. And that's when I knew, okay, maybe there's a book here. Not at the beginning when I was first doing the eulogy thing, because that was a one-on-one thing, but when I saw that you could connect these 2 worlds, I wanted to try to do that. So
one of the things I think, as you said, there's something here. You learned that they had something very much in common. There were similar characteristics or character traits that they shared. What really did kind of unite these 2 men from very different faiths?
Well, many things. For example, both of them had lost children very young. And I remember talking to, I called the rabbi the Reb, so I'm going to keep doing that.
Is that because in Yiddish people say Rebbe?
Well, I don't know. It's because
I couldn't figure out why it wasn't the Rab.
No,
it was the Reb.
Well, for us, it was when we were kids in the synagogue. He was so big and scary that it was like a superhero, like the Thing or the Hulk or the Reb. That's how you refer to the Reb. I thought he wore a cape underneath his robe, and I used to run the opposite direction when he came down the hall. I mean, if I saw him, I literally physically ran. I was so afraid that he would just look at me and go, "I know you sinned," And I didn't even know what I did, but I felt guilty already. And so to actually go back and see him again was sort of odd because I'd always run away from him. But I found out that he had lost a little girl before I was born. She was 4 years old, and she died from an asthma attack, which today would be nothing, but in the 50s they didn't have. And so raced her to the hospital. An hour later, doctor said we couldn't save her, and he howled at God. I mean, he got angry, and he said, "How could you do this to me? Haven't I done enough for you? What did she do? She was a little child." And I said to him, "Well, didn't that make you doubt the existence of God?" And he said, "No, quite the opposite. It was because I had something to yell at and to get angry at and to ask why that I ultimately was able to heal. I would much rather be in a world where I believed that God, for whatever reason, was there but couldn't answer my prayer than to think I lived in a world where there was nothing out there at all." And that is a very big tenet of faith. And it was the same for him as it was for Henry Covington, who also lost a 5-day-old son. and went through the whole thing about, is this because I was bad? Is this because I was a criminal? Are you punishing me? All the rest of it. But again, didn't shake his faith. So, I mean, there are many, many parallels between them. But I think that the idea that you choose to believe in something bigger than yourself, and what all that means, is the thing that unites not only these two people, but also every people of faith really around the whole world.
How did you change? I mean, you told me when the rabbi approached you and asked you if you would do his eulogy that you weren't a particularly religious person.
Right.
And has this experience changed you?
Oh, yeah.
Has it deepened your faith? And
Well,
if so, how?
It's not only deepened my faith, Katie. I'd say the first thing it did was knock the cynicism out of me. And I have to admit that about 10 years ago, you would not have gotten me to sit down in this chair if you told me the subject was faith. I would have said, I'm not
check,
really.
Please.
Yeah, check, please. I don't want to talk about yours, and I really want to talk about mine. I think I focused, like a lot of people, on the bad stuff that happened in the name of faith, church scandals, ethnic cleansing, all this kind of stuff. And by being with these two guys for 8 or 9 years and seeing faith on a small level, not on this global thing, but on a small level, I lost that cynicism. Seeing Henry Covington, for example, at midnight on a cold Detroit night where the church is freezing because they can't afford to heat it, and there are 90 men sleeping on the ground, on the church floor, under blankets, and he's sitting up 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, just watching over them, making sure that they're safe because it's his church and he feels responsible. That's a huge act of faith. Seeing the Reb at 90 years of age, he's long since retired, interrupting our conversation and say, wait a second, and picking up the phone and taking forever to look in the phone book and dial one number at a time, and then getting a congregant on and saying, just calling to see how you are, want to hope that you're in services this weekend, because he believed in the idea of a community, what he called a sacred community, and keeping it together, even though he'd long since been retired and wasn't getting paid for this. You see enough of faith done for the right reasons, because you truly believe in it and because you believe in being good to other people. And you have the cynicism smacked out of you, or else you're a very cold person. And that's probably the biggest thing. And now I'll talk to anybody about their faith. And if it's not mine, it doesn't matter, because I still think that there's something good and pure in faith that's practiced goodly and purely, and not perverted.
Other than the fact that they both lost children, I mean, they're very similar. I think this is an important point that I don't want to totally gloss over, very similar tenets to almost all faiths in terms of charity and service and all those things, compassion. I mean, they're very, very similar, just with different holy books and maybe different robes.
Right. Well, I'll give you another parallel example. Henry, when he first arrived in Detroit, used to drive around in this old black car with food on the hood and the rear and the top of the car, so that people would see that he had food in the poorest neighborhoods and come out, and he would literally feed the hungry. I mean, what's more Christian than that? And one man who came out was a guy named Cass. He was a crack addict, a homeless guy. And he took to him, and one day when he was flooded out of his apartment, somebody broke the pipes and he got flooded out of this place where he was squatting. He came and he said, I can't work for you anymore. I'm all soaked. These are the only clothes I have. And he said, well, where will you live now? And Cass said, I don't have a place. And he said to him, well, why don't you live with me? And he moved him into his own home. This is a stranger. Moved him in his home with his wife and 3 children, not for a night, not for a week, for a year. A year. Took this man into his home. And now that man is not only clean, sober, straightened out, he's an elder of the church, married, has a beautiful little girl, and he will tell you, me, or anybody who's listening, I'm only alive because of the kindness of this one man. And Henry did that, and the Reb did that over and over and over again. In fact, the Reb told me one time, probably something that's sort of universal about what you're asking me, but it's towards the end of his life, and we were talking about heaven, and he loved to sing, Katie. Everything he said was a song. I mean, he could sing the phone book. He would, if he saw you, he'd go, hello, Katie. Well, hello, Katie. It would be like, you always have that silly smile on your face, like, okay, please stop singing. I'm really embarrassed.
No, actually, I like it.
Yeah. Well, if you asked him how he was doing, he always answered, the old gray rabbi ain't what he used to be, ain't what, like that. So I asked him all these questions about heaven. And I was asking him so many that he looks up and he goes, dear Lord, this one has so many questions. Please give him many more years on earth so when we see each other again, we'll have lots to talk about. And I looked at him after I wiped the smile off my face, and I said, do you really think we're going to see each other again? And he said, well, don't you? And I said, well, let's face it, I don't think I'm going where you're going. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, they must have a whole other level for you. You know, you're a man of God.
You're at the penthouse
You're
level,
right.
right?
You're a man of God. And he looked at me as if I were being very naive, and he said, you're a man of God too. Everyone is. And Katie, you could have knocked me over with a brick because he's 90 years old. He is as righteous and pious a man as I've ever met in my life. And for him to put himself on my level and say we're the same is not only an act of humility in my mind, but also is to me what real faith is about and what he had and what Henry had. And that is to say we're all children of God. It's not, I'm more pious than you are, you know, or mine is better than yours is. It's to say you are the same as me. No matter how we practice, we're all children of God, and therefore I have to treat you better. I have to treat you the way I would want to be treated. I mean, that's the golden rule. That's the tenet of most faiths. And when he said that, you know, you're a man of God too. Everyone is. I can still hear him saying it. And if everyone said that to one another, we'd leapfrog over an enormous amount of problems. And I think that that's what unites real people of faith, no matter what their faith is.
Have you started to go to temple more as a result
And
of
I
this
don't go to
experience?
temple more. I go to church more because the church is in Detroit. And I have been dubbed the first official Jewish member of the I Am My Brother's Keeper Ministries Church. And what was funny was when I started going there, you know, to try to get to know Henry better. Because honestly, Katie, I didn't trust him when I first met him. And I'll admit that, and I admit it in the book. Because, well, number one, within 5 minutes of meeting him, he's telling me he'd been incarcerated, and he'd been a thief, and he'd been a drug addict. And, you know, I'm saying, it's just nice that you're honest, but isn't there some point you get disqualified from the pulpit, you know? I mean, isn't there some minimum test score you have to achieve? But when I got to know him behind the pulpit, behind the scenes, and saw him more purely like that, I had to come into his world. And I was going to these services in a plastic tent. This is what they built inside their church, a plastic tent, because it was so cold, and this roof hole that was so big that they up in the front of the sanctuary, had the homeless clients built a plastic wall with 2x4s, and on Sunday mornings they would huddle together with their coats on and pray for a better day in a plastic tent, amazingly, in the 21st century in America. And he's preaching about, you know, drug abuse and crack pipes and things that I've never heard before. And of course, a white guy in the black church, that's a whole nother experience, you know, because
right.
everybody around you is, you know, jumping up, and you're aren't we supposed to sit here like this? And I got over the distrust that I think we all have towards each other's faiths. And so when you say, well, do you go to temple more? I'm more involved in my synagogue now because naturally of the book and all the involvement, but also I don't mind going to this church. It's not my particular strain of religion, but I can feel close to God there, and I like listening to Henry. And I've learned to leap over that hurdle of, well, it's not the same as me, so it can't be good. That's not an attitude to have, and I think if we can break that wall down and say, okay, it's different, but it can still be good. I'd still rather live in a world of faith where everybody has some faith than to live in a world where nobody believes in anything.
You know, I was thinking as you were talking about this church in Detroit, not the homelessness problem in Detroit, and the economic situation in Detroit is so dire. What is it, 30% unemployment right now? I mean, it's just really a tragedy in many ways. And how do these people maintain their faith in such a terribly challenging environment?
I don't know. It's what fascinates me about it. It's what motivates me to do what I do with the homeless in Detroit. I went down and stayed at a homeless shelter about 4 years ago, which is what got me started in it, to write a story about it. I didn't pretend to be anybody I was. I just waited online. I got the blanket, the soap, I got a bed, and I was waiting online for the meal. Mm-hmm. And this gentleman in front of me turns around, he looks at me and says, "Aren't you Mitch Albom?" All the places to be recognized. And I said, yeah. And he looks me up and down again. He goes, "So what happened to you?" And, you know, I laughed too at first, but then I thought, well, you know, that's a perfectly reasonable question.
Yeah.
Where he's standing. Why not me?
Right.
I'm sure he never thought he was going to be there. All I am is, you know, one substance abuse problem away, one bad series of investments away, and I'm on line with him. And I never was able to get that sentence out of my head, even when I came back home to my house in the suburbs. I said, what happened to you? And in Detroit, there are a lot of people who have moments like that, and that's why they get involved. And what's been amazing to me to watch at this church is as our situation has gotten worse and worse and worse, 30% unemployment, nearly 100,000 abandoned buildings in the downtown Detroit just left to rot, more and more volunteers end up coming down and working at that church. Now, why would that be? You would think people would pull in and say, I got to take care of my own. I'm not helping anybody else. I am a charity case. But what they say is, this reminds me that what I have still isn't as bad as it could be. And I feel, especially unemployed people, I feel like I'm doing something. And it's something that I learned about faith and about the sense of community by being around these men that, Katie, you and I we have some similarities in the fields that we chose to be in, and we know that these fields are very consuming, and you're always meeting people, and you can think, well, I need to meet this one because he'll help me with this, and I need to stay networked, I need to stay connected, and many fields are like this. And we spend a lot of our time in work relationships, and weekends are with work relationships, and nights with work relationships, because work is going to take care of us. We're going to feed us, and in the end, we need to have these connections. Well, what's happened in Detroit?
Also for ego reasons.
And ego, okay. And then what happens in Detroit, and it's happened on the national level, is you get let go. And what happens? None of these people want to have anything to do with you. You're contagious. They don't even want you calling them. And at least where I live, where do the people go? To the church or the synagogue. That's where they end up back in. And who brings over the casseroles at night when someone's sick, or who takes up a collection drive when a kid can't afford an operation because the insurance is out? It's the church or it's the synagogue. These are the sacred communities that people belong to. And we're kind of forcing people back into those because we put a lot of faith in this workplace thing that suddenly we realize you're only as important to them as the job that you happen to be doing or the division that didn't get cut out yet. And whereas a church or synagogue, you're there for as long as you want to be there. I don't think God or the men of God ever say, unemployed, can't come here.
Yeah.
There's another church down the street for the unemployed. So I've learned a lot about economic times and how they tie into faith, and there's a connection.
Do you have faith that Detroit will rebound? I mean, it seems so bleak. And I know when you first came here to Detroit, you got a letter from someone saying, welcome to Detroit. We know you won't stay long because nobody good stays for long, but we hope you like it while you're here.
It's one of the reasons I stay. I'm trying
Just
to prove that person wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
I saved that letter because I hadn't even written a column yet for the newspaper I was hired for, and they were already saying, A, glad to have you here, so they were being too nice to me, and B, we know you won't stay, but because all the good people leave, so they're presuming that I'm going to go, and C, but we hope you liked it while we're here, so they're back to the nice thing again. And it's that quality that makes me believe there has to be a way for Detroit to survive. Every other shred of evidence would make me believe that it doesn't, because it is as beleaguered a place, Katie, as I've ever been in America. And our daily bread, the auto industry, has crumbled, and without that, the infrastructure falls apart in Detroit.
But, with the government bailouts, with the good news reported by Ford earlier this week, I mean, can the U.S. auto industry survive? And are you surprised when people get so angry that the government helped bail out?
We're shocked in Detroit
because I think those very people, would be also equally angry if the U.S. auto industry went under. Don't you?
Well, not at first, because they wouldn't realize what that meant. But you cannot be a nation that doesn't manufacture anything. You can't be a country that just goes out and services things and buys everything abroad. The auto industry was more than just making cars. During the Great Wars, it was the auto industry that turned into munitions factories and kept everything going afloat. This is a history of people doing things with their hands and making things that we shouldn't be so quick to throw out so that we can all get into credit derivative swaps or whatever they're called.
Right.
That's nothing. Yeah, but it's all nothing. It's air. It's betting on money. And in Detroit, we do take it personally. When the three auto execs came down for the hearing and all they wanted to talk about was who flew in on a private jet. Okay, it was a bad move. Great. Although many of the Congress people probably flew in on private jets too and went, don't ask me that question. But that wasn't the point. I mean, you're talking about the biggest American manufacturing thing. I think they somehow said that 1 in every 10 jobs in America is somehow connected to the auto business.
People don't realize the ancillary jobs that are involved in terms of people who are making seats or transmissions or this, that. that, and the other thing that are all involved in the
right.
auto industry.
And in Detroit, it isn't 1 in 10; it's 7, 8 in 10.
Right.
And so when that goes under, it basically was America saying to us, "Well, too bad for you. Good luck sinking." And meanwhile, we were seeing senators from states that had foreign auto manufacturers, making the biggest argument against us. So it was a really rough stretch. I'm glad that Ford seems to have survived. I don't know what's going to happen with GM. Chrysler is a shadow of whatever it was. We don't even know what it is or who actually really runs it or owns it. But it's not the same as it once was, Katie. I don't think it ever will be.
Can I ask you a few sports questions before you go? Because I don't really get to
like.
talk to a sports guy that often. So, what do you think about A-Rod? Do you think he's had his first really good postseason? He was so derided for choking in the postseason. I sound like I know what I'm talking about, don't I?
Yeah, pretty good.
But do you think,
pretty good.
he's the one who looked at me, Mitch, and said, I have never done steroids.
I saw that interview.
And of course, we've learned otherwise. But do you think he he seems to have found himself a little bit in this season. Are you an A-Rod fan or not?
One thing I've learned, Katie, after having done the sports thing for, almost 3 decades is nobody really knows nobody in this business.
That's true.
So for me to try to analyze him sitting in a chair with you as to
but
who he's really
many people sure do, right?
Well, they do. Well, it's a sport in and of itself, breaking down who he is, and especially in New York where, you have all the other stuff about seen here, seen there, seen with this actress, seen with this person. In Detroit, we just happy to be seen, period. It's never with anybody. But I don't know. He's hit a few baseballs well in a World Series and in a postseason, and suddenly everything that was wrong with him is right.
Yeah.
I don't think there was that much wrong with him when he wasn't hitting it, and I don't think it's all flipped around because he happens to be dating one particular person. He finally relaxed enough to perform in a postseason. Good for him. He's an extraordinarily talented player. Good for him. He clearly has a problem with the truth in certain situations, as you witnessed. Bad for him. And like most things, it's a gray area. Everyone wants to say he's the great guy or he's the bad guy. He's got good and bad in him, like most of us.
Like everybody.
Yeah, like everybody. That was a good question, though. It sounded right up there with that sports thing. It's very good.
Andre Agassi has come out with a book called Open, and I profiled him for 60 Minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious that, a lot of tennis players, particularly Martina Navratilova, jumped all over him for his admission that he did crystal meth for a period of time when he was sort of in the depths of depression, he told me. Do you think he's being judged too harshly, or is it right to feel extremely disappointed in his behavior?
Well, I would say, who am I to be disappointed in Andre Agassi's behavior? He didn't let me down. I mean, if this is what, and I don't think he let Martina Navratilova down either. I mean, I've known Martina Navratilova a little over the years, and I'm sure she's had moments where she's felt bad in her life, and however she dealt with it is her way. And if this was his way, I wonder sometimes about things that come out 20 years later and a book comes out. And I'm in the book business, so I know it. But I try not to write books that have some big hook, revelation, like, okay, this is what everybody's going to talk about.
I don't think that's what he wants everyone to talk about.
But it is, isn't it? And it always is. It's that 1.5 page in these biographies about who slept with who or who took one drug, and everybody focuses on that. And then inevitably, what happens is the subject says, but that's not, the book is about so much more than that. But at the same token, I know the book business, and someone was saying, ooh, this is a headline. Ooh, it's a bullet point, and people are going to talk about it. So if you didn't want it talked about, don't bring it up.
But how can? Well, I think your cynicism that you told me you've gotten rid of.
I said I got rid of it towards faith,
reappeared,
not
reared its
sports.
ugly head.
Yeah, well, I'm not.
I think he would
that.
say I can't write a book called Open without telling people everything about my life.
Well, having said that, I'm not judgmental of him. If that's, I'm glad he got off of it, and I'm glad he straightened out. But I don't know too much about it. It is always interesting to see. And this is what I've taken from fame, Katie, and you've met far more famous people than I have, but I've met a share. It ain't what it's cracked up to be. And I've never, thankfully, pursued fame for fame's sake. and I don't ever want to. And I remember I play in a band with some writers,
Like
some,
Dave Barry
Dave
and
Barry,
Stephen King.
and Stephen King one
Wait,
time.
there's Amy Tan's in it too, right?
Ridley Pearson, Greg
It's a little
Iles.
scary that I know this.
Yeah, it's really scary because we're really terrible.
I heard.
Yeah,
I haven't
yeah,
listened to you, but
yeah.
I've heard
well,
you're really
please
bad.
don't. Well, yeah, we're better off not listened to. We're one of the bands that our music actually gets better the further away you get from it. But Stephen one time was they were playing a show and a fan lit all her fingernails on fire.
Oh.
And went to the stage and held it up. And one of the guys in the band turned to another one and said, "I don't ever want to be that famous." And I have that attitude too. It's nice to be known and hopefully known for the right things, but big fame, like athletes get and all the rest of it, can do funny things to you.
Howard Stringer at Walter Cronkite's funeral described the bright, hot spotlight that could burn as much as illuminate. And I thought that was a very good way of putting sort of the whole experience.
Or in America, even more. It's almost like, I make the joke, a leaf and the sun get along just fine until you put a magnifying glass between them. And then the leaf is disintegrated, right? Well, that magnifying glass can be, attention, spotlight, media, fame. And I've seen it working on the other side. And so I always try to keep the right distance from it to, keep my family and myself sane.
Yeah, I hear you on that.
Yeah.
Hey, by the way, I want to mention before you go really quickly, I thought this was so nice. You're not doing a traditional book tour.
No.
You're actually taking your book and talking to churches and at synagogues and at homeless shelters, which is, I guess, probably the first ever book tour that's held that way, right?
Yes, especially since we give the books away. It's probably not really healthy for the publishers or the bookstores, but I've done the whole, I've been blessed enough to do the bookstore thing on several other books, and you go and you sign and you sign and you sign. And I try to talk to people when I'm at the store, try to tell a little story, and it's hard to stand on a table in a bookstore with a latte machine going off in the background.
And with a line of people who they're trying to usher through.
And you're trying to say, but God is and faith is. And so
they're like, move it along.
Yeah. And they're making did you want mocha with that? And so I said to them at the beginning, I don't want to go to any bookstores. I want to go to the places that you mentioned. I want it to be quiet. I want to be able to talk about this. And I want every one of the things to have an element that we go in the daytime to a soup kitchen or a shelter or whatever and tell some of the stories. And that's been some of the most fascinating places that we've stopped. And to see people who are their own version of Henry Covington, before he turned his life around.
Right.
And they hear his story and they hear about this church with a hole in its roof and how we're going to fix that hole. And that whole metaphor about, everybody's got a hole in the roof in some way.
Right.
There's some part of all of us that rain comes in, and we're trying to fix it and we're trying to patch it. And you can see some legitimate hope in people's eyes. And I don't know, I would love to continue doing these kind of book tours and not so much the bookstores. You really get to see people and compare, and you get to see the poverty of this country all around the country and how it differs in different areas, but how everyone is still, when I tell the story and I say, and Henry looked up and he said, Jesus, get me out of this, and he did, or, he was okay. Dead silence. And you can see that there is a hunger in every one of those faces and eyes. Could that be for me tomorrow? Can tomorrow be the day that I change or life changes for me? And it's hope. The last line of the book has to do with hope, and I believe hope and faith are like this. And so when I say have a little faith, it's not in a way of, you need to be this religious or you need to do this ritual, you need to do that. It's that belief that by being better to one another and by believing in something, we have a purpose here that's a little more than just, getting mine, that tomorrow can be better. And I believe it can.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end this than that. Mitch Albom, thank you.
Thanks,
the book
Katie.
is Have a Little Faith, a true story. And you have no idea what you're going to do next, right? It'll come to you?
Yeah, give me a few years.
Okay, yeah,
I'll
see
come
me
back
in
and
3
see you
years.
again. Have another sports question for me, please.
I will.
All right.
Thank you so
Nice to
much,
see
Mitch.
you.
And thank you all for joining us today. And now stay tuned for a message from our sponsor, Dove.